Delhi G20 summit, the fact that they managed to get a joint declaration. It has 8 paragraphs on the war in Ukraine without any direct reference to Russia. Do you see this as a success of India's diplomacy, success of India's negotiators? And will this go down after what we've seen through the course of the last 1 year, how deeply polarizing this war had become? The fact that negotiators managed to clinch a joint declaration, would this in and of itself qualify as historic for the Delhi G20 summit?
Well, I think clearly this was a successful summit. You can see it in the comprehensive declaration, the fact that it dealt with everything from digital public infrastructure to empowering women and girls, to equitable, sustainable economic growth. The fact that they announced the rail and energy corridor from India through the Middle East to Europe. All of this points to a highly successful G20 summit. But, I think the fact that the statement was weaker on Ukraine than last year's Bali statement, actually, that's the one disappointing factor. I think that the fact that Russia was not named means that, this was certainly a weaker statement. We've heard that from Ukrainian leaders. So, even though it was a very successful summit, it was disappointing that the language on Ukraine was not as strong. And I think, frankly, the U.S. and the other Western countries did a favor for India by allowing this language to be much weaker than it was a year ago. And hopefully that doesn't mean that there'll be less international support for Ukraine moving forward.
We'll also try and understand why such a thing came to pass, in the sense that why was the G7 allowing such a milder language to come through. But I want to go across to Ashok Mukherjee, who's been in the room in such hectic negotiations in the past as well. Till Friday night, Mr. Mukherjee, even the negotiators were not hopeful that they will be able to thrash out the paragraphs on the Ukrainian war. Yes, from 2 paragraphs in the Bali Declaration, they've got now 8 paragraphs, culminating with that famous sentence from the Prime Minister that this is not the era of war, this is the era of peace. But the criticism is that there's no direct mention of Russia. Do you believe that that's what clinched the deal? And how does India respond to this, as Lisa Curtis said, milder than Bali statement?
Well, Zaka, thank you for asking me on your show. I think that the key answer to your question is in that one sentence paragraph, that this is not an era of war. I think that is what propelled the discussions, the negotiations, the consensus. We heard the Sherpa, Mr. Amitav Kant, speak yesterday from the site of the negotiations on how the consensus was crafted. It required the cooperation of all the G20 members. So I think that including Russia, including China, including the G7, these being the 2 major parties, if I may call them, to the way the Ukraine issue was put into the declaration. But I think the end, this is not an era of war, is very important because of what the Prime Minister said today. But actually, the responsibility for bringing peace is on the Security Council. And until the Security Council is reformed, there is no way any other body outside under international law can deal with bringing peace and ensuring this is not an era of war. In Ukraine and in other regions of the world, there are 52 conflicts going on as I speak, which are on the agenda of the Security Council, and it's helpless. So it has to be reformed. And I think that is the key message, and that is the key objective of India's diplomacy in the next 2 years as we lead up to the 80th anniversary summit of the United Nations in 2025. And this is one big message, that the success of Indian diplomacy in the Delhi G20 summit has actually conveyed to the wider world, including the membership of the United Nations in New York.
Okay, I have with me Mr. Ehsan here. The fact that you represent a business council, the fact that you represent the voice of the Global South, and now you have the African Union that has been included as a permanent member of the G20, and possibly in Brazil in the next year, when Brazil hosts the G20, you could have the Committee of Latin American Nations also included. How and why, from a business perspective, do you believe the inclusion of these newer members is important for the G20?
It's important for a number of reasons. One of them, it is a conflict reduction mechanism, if you think about it, because you'll have more people at the table discussing their own issues. If you remember, and I'm pretty sure that our viewers remember vividly, that in the various G20 summits, the African issues being there, either directly or indirectly, relevant to poverty, relevant to public debt, relevant to climate change, and so on and so forth. So it makes lots of sense. And I think it served the very important goal of the G20 to be more inclusive. So that's being inclusive, to have Africa there.
From a business point of view, now you have a new green climate initiative, you have the digital public infrastructure, which India has been a big proponent of, unified payment interface, financial transactions digitally done, so on. There is talk about regulating cryptocurrencies globally. From a business point of view, and particularly after 2.5, 3 years of COVID, and we're seeing slowdowns across the world, do you believe that this G20 has done enough to try and put the focus back on what it was meant to do originally, and that is to talk about business and economy and growth and moving the planet forward?
I think going through the declaration yesterday, a great deal of grounds being covered by this summit, really, and it started in a very good, positive, important milestone, which is the inclusion of the African Union, and also to make sure that the communique, as you mentioned in your first part, it smooth out a good language, and it is really a time of peace. It's not time of war. And that was very clear through the, in the sideline of the summit, where we have the corridor understanding through India, the Gulf, and Europe. So here, this is talking about things positively, achieving things, and that's inclusion, rather than, wasting time, getting into disputes and then resolving the disputes. So this is the time of peace. And when we talk about economic development and growth, and this is all about, when you're talking about the G20, the global muscles of the global economy, then you need peace and you need stability, of course.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Ehsan. Thank you for your time. I also am joined by Niranjan Hiranandani of the Hiranandani Group. And a lot of focus, Mr. Hiranandani, has been on this infrastructure corridor that's been announced, this economic corridor, all the way from Asia to Arabia to Europa, as many are calling it. There has been sort of a lot of debate around these big infrastructure projects. We've seen Chinese debt, how smaller countries are getting affected by it. The question mark that always remains over these infrastructure projects is about debt financing. How will this be different from whatever else we've seen in the past, including the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, as they call it?
I think the most important thing is the fact that this economic corridor lays a new connectivity for India to be connected to the Middle East and Europe by a more efficient transport system. So benefit number one is the fact that India will benefit in terms of trade and other things, so that the transportation and other costs for the purposes of doing business with Europe and the Middle East will come down. I think that is the most important thing to see. Number two, the economic ideas which the Chinese moved into various countries of the world is sought to be neutralized by this proposition which has come up over here. Obviously, the corridor has to pay for itself, but there is no direct debt program which will actually affect them or take away the benefits of that, as has happened in other countries where China's have put their footprint into it. But the most important factor is the fact that the country's cooperation is between nations which now control 80% of the GDP of the entire world. So the G20, including the European Union, now controls 80% of the GDP of the entire world. So all the consensus which has come through the statement, as well as the dealings and businesses which have happened on the sidelines of G20 become even more important. So if you're talking about the understanding with the United States in terms of
Okay.
aircraft engines that we are talking about technology, about the manufacturing of chips, all these other factors are on the sidelines have happened, are actually double or triple the main manifesto which has come out in the open. So, and also the fact that the discussions on
Okay.
the sidelines with each of the countries has taken a big leap into a different corridor of business that is going to happen in the future. So I think India has taken big advantage of the fact that this declaration has been signed, accepted, and also the fact that this given an opportunity of all the
All right.
leaders in the world to set up new benchmarks of economics and business, which is a different ballgame completely. And the geopolitical leadership of India is now completely recognized.
Yeah. Ashok Mukherjee, I'm sure even in your time in the service, we were talking about this North-South corridor project. We were talking about Chabahar in Iran. With the announcement of this economic corridor yesterday between the Gulf countries and all the way to Western Europe, are we now putting a lid on this whole North-South corridor? And of course, there are geopolitical issues with Iran beyond the control of India, as a result of which Chabahar hasn't exactly taken off the way India was hoping it would. So are we putting a lid on that project, the North-South corridor project?
I think that the project that was announced yesterday by a group of countries in the G20 meeting for a rail link from India across the Arabian Sea to UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and onwards to Europe is a supplement to the connectivity between the Indo-Pacific and Europe. The existing connectivity is through the Suez Canal. And I think that I'm sure that the proponents of this new project have kept in mind that you cannot really bypass or erase the Suez Canal, because in sheer volume, the sea lanes of communication of the Western Indo-Pacific carry a huge amount of trade that goes from India to the West and that comes from the West to India. So we would not be shooting ourselves in the feet by submerging the Suez Canal and only focusing on this railway link. The second point is that the north-south connectivity, if you recall, was to connect Helsinki to Singapore. That was how eventually it evolved in 2006, 2007, when the situation in Eurasia was very different from what it is today. So whether the viability of the north-south transport corridor in terms of the cargo carried, the volumes, the profits to be made by the companies, etc., whether all those factors remain as they were 10 years ago or not, I think is an open question. We have had the first activization of the north-south transport corridor, and ironically enough, this was cargo from Russia to Saudi Arabia that used the north-south transport corridor. So the corridor exists. Now, what use the corridor is put to, it depends on the countries which are parties to the north-south transport corridor. The Chabahar project was focused on Afghanistan. And it's very unfortunate that in the middle of all these discussions of the G20, we have not even given one word on Afghanistan and on the fact that half the population of Afghanistan has been deprived of its human rights. I think it's a real pity that nobody had time to even mention this. Thank you.
I want to ask Lisa Curtis this, and I come back to where we started about what you call the dilution of language, specifically with reference to Russia and its war in Ukraine. Two things. One, if they couldn't come to a common language acceptable to all parties, then there would be no joint declaration. And no matter what other outcomes the Delhi summit achieved, this would be the headline that no joint declaration, and therefore, the first summit in the history of the G20 to not come to a joint declaration. So was there a realization within the Western countries, particularly the United States itself, that they cannot afford for India and the India-hosted G20 summit to fail? And is that perhaps why they agreed to what you're calling a dilution of language?
I think that's right. I think the United States and the other countries that have been very supportive of Ukraine realized that it was extremely important that this G20 summit be a success, I think they all wanted to show support for India's leadership role. The fact that, President Biden was there and had such a positive attitude, the fact that Prime Minister Modi and President Biden had this very productive meeting. I think all of this shows that the U.S. and the other countries wanted to support India. And unlike President Xi, who didn't bother to show up at the meeting, they have shown that India's leadership is important, that India is a bridge to the global South, and they wanted to show this. And I think that's right. That is why the language was softer. They wanted to make sure that there was an agreement. And there are so many positive things that have come out of this meeting, and so much hard work by India over the last 8-9 months in the run-up to getting this work done. And so it is important that that wasn't overshadowed, and that China was not allowed to hold up this moment in the sun for India.
All right. Lisa Curtis, Ashok Mukherjee, and Niranjan Hiranandani, thank you so much for joining us on this special broadcast coming to you from the Media Center, the International Media Center here at the Bharat Mandapam. Before I get to the joint statement, and there's a lot of wonder at how the negotiators managed to find this common language that's acceptable to all and to adopt it by consensus, I want to talk about this economic corridor because a lot is being made about it. The announcement by India, the United States, Saudi Arabia, UAE, France, Germany and Italy, backed by the European Union, to have this economic corridor, which is not just a land-based one or a rail one. It could also be for optic fibers. It could also be for transmitting data, transmitting gas. What do you make of such an ambitious project that was announced on the sidelines of the G20 here? Because many are saying that this is a direct challenge to the Belt and Road Initiative of China, the signature foreign policy move of Xi Jinping. How do you think this is being viewed in Beijing? Is it the G20 sort of throwing the gauntlet at China?
Well, I guess from my perspective, it's a good thing. We need India to contribute to the world's economy. We need to get India firing on all cylinders. And so I don't necessarily see it has to be in conflict with China. If we're going to have a prosperous world, we need China and India both doing well. And so, a little competition is good, but I think we should see it actually in a very positive way.
But Professor Schmidt, the view from Beijing is that you look at, the wider region, in the backyard of China, if you will. You have the Quad, you have AUKUS, now you have this economic corridor that's stretching all the way from India through Arabia into Europa, as many are calling it. China would look at it and feel like this is a case of encirclement, if you will. This is a case of trying to stop China's rise. You have the United States allies like South Korea and Japan already in a consensus that we saw at the Camp David a few weeks ago. So wouldn't the view from Beijing on this be that while America and India and Australia and other countries accuse China of hegemonic behavior, what they are effectively doing is to encircle China?
I think we can always look at things from a point of view of conflict and of strategic adversarialness. And so in the end, what I see going forward for the next 20, 30, 40 years is the world needs to come to terms with global sustainability, is we're going to have to learn to cooperate. And so, yes, you can look at it through a containment of China lens, but it needs to happen to have both China and India thrive and prosper. So, as I said, in the world today, people like to see it as a conflict. I'm a glass half empty type of person, only rarely. So I really want to look at this from a positive point of view as a chance for India to assert itself and, really taking a front foot approach to helping the world get done what needs to happen over the next 20 or 30 years.
I do want to talk a little bit, Professor Schmidt, about the joint statement. The fact that it actually came through 12 hours before the joint statement came through. Even the negotiators were not hopeful that it will. But finally it did. and there are about 8 or 9 paragraphs on the Russia-Ukraine war, about 8 paragraphs, ending with, of course, the famous words by Prime Minister that this is not the era of war, this is an era of peace. There is a view, which is, of course, Ukraine is saying it publicly, but some others are saying it in private as well, that Russia has not been named directly in any of those paragraphs. And that's perhaps what clinched it. But they're saying that this is a dilution of Russia's transgressions. This is a dilution also from the Bali declaration that happened a year ago. How would you read it?
Well, it shows how difficult it is to reach consensus in a large group of 20 nations, or in this case, sort of 19. It is, to my mind, it's probably not as strong as perhaps I would have liked to have seen. But on the other hand, I see the intent of the vast majority of the G20 is clear. The Ukraine war is clearly singled out as something that is bad and needs to be rectified. And so I wouldn't be thinking it gives Russia any happiness that it's somehow off the hook. Indeed, it's a bit of a vice, I think, coming down, but it is, I think, a lost chance for maybe a little bit more strength from the G20, but perhaps not surprising. These are just very, very different.
A whole bunch of financial agreements and financial deals have been struck as part of the outcomes of the Delhi G20 summit, from digital public infrastructure, which India is very, very keen on pushing across the world, to a new green climate finance action plan. And of course, there is the contentious issue of debt restructuring of infrastructure projects. To discuss all this and more and what the Delhi G20 summit has achieved in financial terms, in the financial realm, I'm now joined by Mr. K.V. Subramanian. He's the former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Thank you very much, Mr. Subramanian, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. First things first, this whole push about digital public infrastructure for financial transactions, the whole world has seen how India's UPI has been very successful. India has bilateral agreements with a few individual countries, Singapore, France, etc. But the first time that the G20 has spent a substantial amount of time in the joint declaration talking about creating a digital public infrastructure for financial transactions. What do you make of that?
I think that really signals India as the digital leader of the world. India has demonstrated very clearly how during COVID we used the digital public infrastructure to really reach out to the common person in a way that was unprecedented. That kind of reach wouldn't have been possible during COVID, but for the digital public infrastructure that we have built. And now India is demonstrating to the world that what it has done at home is what the rest of the world can do as well. So it clearly marks out as India as a digital leader. It will help in bringing productivity gains, as we are seeing in India itself, and more importantly, enable growth to become inclusive.
One of the other issues has been this new mechanism for green climate action financing. Now, some years ago, there was this Green Climate Fund that was announced, $100 billion that the developed countries were supposed to give to developing countries. I don't know how much of that money has actually been transferred. But it boils down to this moot point, which is that the developed countries, the industrialized countries, which have polluted the world for the last 200, 300 years because of industrialization and beyond that, are simply unwilling to cough up the money. And every few years, we just keep coming up with these new terms and new mechanisms. Ultimately, it doesn't amount to much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is true. But what we have to realize here is that you are asking the current population, in the developed economies to actually cough up money for sins committed by their, by their ancestors, their fathers, grandfathers, and beyond. And that is not something that becomes politically very feasible, saying, your parents or grandparents actually, enjoyed at your expense, so you cough up the money. You can imagine how politically acceptable that will be. That's, the reason that, this has not gone too far. I am, very clear that, of course, the problems of climate change that we are seeing is primarily because of the sins of the advanced economies. In fact, if we talk about the stock of global carbon emissions, almost 95% or 99% of it is that stock has been created by the advanced economies. But I think in the Delhi Declaration there has been progress beyond these usual words that are spoken, because for the first time there is also an emphasis on enabling more private finance to come in, and I think that is something which is a very welcome move. And by now, there is definitely a realization that mere words are not going to help in tackling this problem of climate change.
I also want to talk to you about debt restructuring, particularly for infrastructure projects. And we have seen how smaller countries in Asia, in Africa, reeling under Chinese debt, have been protesting. There have been almost revolts in some of those countries. In light of that, the announcement of this economic corridor between India, the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, going all the way to Western Europe, the question comes back to, again, how are you going to finance this? I mean, is it going to be public finances? Is it going to be private finances? Who is going to foot the bill?
So there are two issues that you are raising here, and I want to answer both of these. The first question that you raised was about overall debt distress itself, and here the G20 and especially India's presidency has clearly marked out uncharted territory by bringing the Global Debt Restructuring Roundtable, which is a significant improvement on the common framework that was there, which was not going too far. Firstly, it was not applicable to many of the middle-income countries like Sri Lanka, and the processes were very slow because it included creditors that were beyond the Paris Club. So that's one issue. And here, the headway that has been made through the Global Debt Restructuring Roundtable, I think, is definitely noteworthy. The second point that you're talking about, which is, in terms of infrastructure, the fact that what is envisaged here is essentially a new Silk Route, and that is primarily to enable trade at a time when the trend against globalization, against trade seems to be very high, especially given the focus on that every country seems to have on its own taking care of its own sort of economy. Now here the clearly infrastructure financing will have to be done significantly by the public exchequer, in each of these countries, because infrastructure is something where private financing is not going to come in large numbers. So the way India has demonstrated now with the infrastructure creation here, that's how the other countries in this corridor will have to actually match up.
All right, Mr. K.V. Subramaniam, thank you very much for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. All right, so the New Delhi Declaration has been adopted. The negotiations going on to the final hours, even up until this morning. Consensus language has been found. There is, of course, criticism that the language against Russia and the war in Ukraine has been diluted somewhat. And also there is the other big announcement of the economic corridor from Asia through the Middle East, all the way to Western Europe. Joining me now is a professor at the Columbia University and someone who has seen very closely the developments of the G20 over the last 15 years or so, since it's been moved to the heads of state and heads of government level. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, thank you very much for joining us on this special broadcast. First of all, what do you make of this New Delhi Declaration? There are 8 paragraphs dealing with the war in Ukraine. There is no direct reference to Russia. Do you believe that was the clincher and that's how all countries gave their consent to this declaration?
This is a very good declaration, and this is a very big success for India. So I would really congratulate the government of India for this. I think everybody was wise to back off of trying to break this G20 over the question of Ukraine, which is a more complicated question, perhaps, than either side wants to admit. It's not all good and evil as the United States or others think. So they backed off, and this declaration focused on a lot of very important matters around economy, finance, sustainable development, climate, fighting poverty. and it is a consensus document, and it's a very well done document. Now, the key is to implement it, but the aspirations that are expressed in this document are really well directed. I'm very pleased with it.
I'm curious to know what's your best understanding of how the West, the US, its European partners, given how polarizing this war was and has become, how did they agree to a text, a draft, which does not mention Russia at all?
Well, I think this is a success of Prime Minister Modi. It's a respect to India as host of the G20. It is a realization, perhaps, by the US and Europe that breaking apart the G20 in this way not only would be an embarrassment to India, but ultimately would be an embarrassment to the US and Europe. You know, the world does not see eye to eye with the US government on how it interprets this war. I don't, by the way, at all. I think that this war in significant part came from Washington relentlessly trying to expand NATO to Russia's border, and that was extremely dangerous, provocative, and unwise. Well, the United States doesn't view it that way. It wants to blame everything on Russia. But the fact of the matter is, most of the world doesn't side with the US on this. Most of the world sides with peace, and would the leading powers stop making trouble for everybody and sit down and negotiate. And that's really the spirit of this document. And I think it was a lot of very capable diplomacy by India, and personal diplomacy, I would add, by Prime Minister Modi that brought the success to this joint declaration and to the summit.
I also want to know your thoughts on this new economic corridor that's been launched from India, involving the UAE and Saudi Arabia, going all the way to France and Germany, of course, backed by the United States. Do you think this is a direct challenge to the Belt and Road Initiative of China?
You know, it's a road, and it's good. Of course, the United States, again, the U.S. government is almost childish in seeing everything as something against someone else. This is part of the needed interconnections across Eurasia. So it's desirable. It is absolutely complementary to the Belt and Road Initiative. If we could actually behave better than children and not see everything as a challenge to someone else, but actually as something where we cooperate, we would understand the world better and make the world better. This corridor sounds like a very good idea, but it's part of the same vision as the Belt and Road Initiative. And I want the United States government, I hope the government of India and others don't badmouth the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a very valuable initiative. It is complementary to this initiative, but it's all part of the same idea of creating an interconnected, modern, peaceful infrastructure of trade. And in this sense, I'm happy with this initiative, but I'm not happy with it being called a rebuke to the Belt and Road or an answer to the Belt and Road. That's nonsense. It's a road, is what it is, and it's a corridor that we need.
And very quickly, how may, many are saying that the G20 here in Delhi sort of symbolizes or ushers in a sort of a slightly more nuanced positioning when it comes to this emerging world order. The war in Ukraine, clearly, it has not gone as per the West's expectations or as per Ukraine's expectations. So maybe there is a bit of a tempering down of the West's own capabilities and perhaps certainly Ukraine's own capabilities. And now you have this corridor involving US partners and allies, the likes of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the Middle East. And then you have France, Germany and Italy in Western Europe. Is this a pitch yet again by the US? Of course, incorporating countries like India to once again push collectively through these multilateral channels and fora, perhaps in a way to send out a signal to Beijing?
Again, we are in a multipolar world. We're in a world where China is a superpower, India is a superpower, the United States is a superpower. We're in a multipolar world. The idea that this is a game where now the US and India team up against China is not a reality. India has its own interests. China has its own interests. The US has its own interests. Everybody needs to behave respectfully because each region is powerful. Each region is part of a global cooperation. This is not a game. This is not a game of chess. This is not a game of Risk. This is not a game on a chessboard. It's not a game at all. It's actually our one Earth, one family, one future, to quote the opening line of this G20. And so I really want us to move beyond, can the US create a new alliance against China? That is America's thinking, but I have no patience for it. It's absolutely anachronistic to think that India is somehow going to side with the West against China is very naive. India is a major power, 1.4 billion people, with a lot of interests and a lot of complexity and a lot of strong positive relations with China and a lot of difficult relations with China. And suddenly, India is not suddenly going to be part of the West. India is actually the main part of South Asia. South Asia is an even bigger part of the world. But the idea that you somehow put these pieces together in these alliances is, to my mind, outmoded thinking in an interconnected, multipolar world. And of course, it's America's thinking, but please, everybody should remember, what is America's idea? It's to be number one in the world. Well, how silly is that? That's childish. That's still America's idea. I would not succumb to it, frankly.
All right. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us with your thoughts on the New Delhi Declaration and what's been achieved in this Delhi edition of the G20 Heads of State Summit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you.